If you want a reader to read to the end, well, they've got to have somewhere to go.
Well, I can't wait to see where this one goes.
In every middle schooler's life, there comes the momentous day when you learn that speed and velocity are not the same thing. I mean, they're roughly the same thing. Speed is how fast something goes, distance covered divided by time, and velocity is also that, but with the addition of a direction. So 75 centimeters a minute is a speed. 75 centimeters a minute due north is a velocity. That was also the same day that we learned the distinction between distance and displacement. Now, distance is easy. That's how far something travels, like 15.8 yards. But displacement, like velocity is to speed, is distance with extra rules. So displacement is how far you end up from the spot where you started. Walk 15.8 yards to the west and then 10 yards to the east, and your total distance may be 25.8 yards, but your displacement is only 5.8. And it seemed especially hurtful when our teacher told us that if we were running a mile in gym class and ended right where we had started, then our total displacement would be 0. And that really only seemed to amplify the crime against decency that the run-a-mile test already was. It was an insult added to injury. Because after running a mile, you want to feel like you ran a mile, and of course you did, but having a displacement of 0 feels pretty awful. Congratulations, they might say, all that effort amounted to nothing.
Oh, hey, that's what those historians writing the book about writing with Andrew said, too.
Hey now. But, of course, I'm not physics with Andrew, I'm writing with Andrew. So you might be wondering what this interdisciplinary opener is all about. And it's not just a dangerous game of chicken with viewer retention during the first 30 seconds of the video. It's also something I think about a lot when I'm reviewing other writers' work. See, not only does it feel bad to run 4 laps and end up with a displacement of 0, it also feels bad to read a whole story or poem or research paper that just doesn't seem to go anywhere, that just kind of exists without having a clear sense of direction. So where vectors have magnitude and direction, they actually go somewhere. They can be a handy way to think about what our readers want from our work. They want direction, and they want displacement. They want a sense that they ended up somewhere different from where they started. And yet it's really common to see writing that doesn't offer that experience. I remember being in college and feeling like I should watch TED Talks because it seemed like a thing that smart people did, and I wanted to be a smart person. But as I watched more of them, I got increasingly frustrated with them. They all had really interesting titles, but they generally seemed not to actually say anything useful. So I had a thought the other day. It was an interesting thought, and as I thought it, I was actually pulling weeds in the garden at this time while my daughters and cat were napping inside. I thought, I should share this thought. So I started a blog, and I started sharing my thought. At its peak, my thought had been shared with over 15 million readers. But it eventually got to the point that I was more interested in the readers than in the thought. And this might be hard to believe, but I decided to shut down that blog, spend more time in the garden with my daughters and cat, which by then I could do because my thought had made me a millionaire. And now you might be wondering, what can I do with that thought? What's the takeaway for me? And that is exactly the right question to ask. Thank you. Now, my caricature of a TED Talk is a piece that takes us ultimately nowhere, and that makes it a really unsatisfying thing to listen to. Once I had decided that TED Talks weren't actually going to take me anywhere, I gave up on them and consequently on being smart. But it's not just parodies of TED Talks that are worthless. What happens when the hero in your fantasy epic goes on a grand journey and then comes home and just resumes the life they lived before they left? What happens when you write a poem that only just describes a hyacinth bouquet? What happens if you write a research paper that only repeats what your sources say? Let's imagine a piece of writing happening on a plane. Since this is physics, we'll also pretend that there is no friction or gravity and that your story is a point particle. As my high school physics teacher once said, we teach things that aren't true because you're not capable of handling things that are true. So here's your fantasy epic. Look at all these twists and turns in the story, all the exciting surprises and stunning reversals of fortune. Then your hero defeats the evil wizard and returns home. Or here's a research paper that covers a lot of sources but really only does that. By the end, we know exactly as much as we would have known if we had just read those sources. If you were to draw a vector from the starting point to the ending point, how far would you have moved from the starting point, and in what direction? Obviously nowhere. There isn't a vector. Displacement is 0, velocity is 0, and consequently, Reader satisfaction is also 0. But then look at something like Kay Ryan's poem Things Shouldn't Be So Hard, which starts out making you think that life should be easier, but then it hops and steps from one object to another that should be worn down in the house of someone who has passed. The speaker wants to see ruts worn in the floor, doorknobs worn down to nothing, some trace, any trace that the person they loved left behind. When the poem reasserts that things shouldn't be so hard, it's a declaration with a wholly transformed meaning. We did not end where we started. And we can draw a vector from our starting point to the end point, magnitude and direction. It is a short poem, but it still takes us somewhere. We live through the series of images and gain an insight we didn't have before. Or take a rhetorical analysis paper that doesn't just tell us that a presidential speech has logos, but also shows how politicians can use logos to mislead the public. This paper doesn't just tell us what's there, it also draws new conclusions. It takes us somewhere different from where we started. It's a vector. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it's a solid reminder that a piece of writing that doesn't go anywhere, that ends up exactly where it started out, is probably going to be a disappointing piece of writing. And two, pick your genre and you're bound to find all kinds of people proposing all kinds of frameworks and structures and templates for writing a successful play or poem or literature review. And those can be helpful tools, but they can make you feel like your job is much harder, or at least more complex than it really is. Sure, you can do the hero's journey or the save the cat or whatever else, but simplify your life and your process by just remembering that your writing has to go somewhere. The exact path matters less than the fact that it takes the reader somewhere new. And there's all kinds of ways to do it, usually depending on what you're writing. So, for example, readers of fiction often want to see not only that the conflict driving the plot gets resolved, but also that the main characters have changed somehow in the process. So the plot and characters are vectors. They should end up somewhere different from where they started out. Spend time around poetry people and you'll often hear them talk about a poem's emotional arc, which we could translate to vector. Readers of poetry want the poem to take them to a new emotional state. And I've heard essayists talk about arcs too, but in a much broader sense. So what's the arc of the piece? Sure, you could just tell us a story from your childhood, but you could also take us somewhere new by reflecting on that experience and drawing new insights out of your commentary. Don't just tell us what happened, transform the experience as you write about it. Show us why it matters. Then we're not just sharing stories, but also thinking about how we could draw meaning from our own experiences. We're zipping along a vector. Whatever you're writing, it has to have direction. It has to go somewhere. But you also want it to go somewhere satisfying, and that's where we can talk about that vector's magnitude. Yes, your writing does have to go somewhere, but how far does it have to go?
Well, probably the farther away from me, the better, I think.
I mean, that's one way to think about it, Bud, but I think it's more helpful to think about the magnitude of your vector scaling with the scope of your project. And length is a quick and easy place to start. If I'm going to get on a bus for 8 hours, I'd better end up farther away than the next block over. Similarly, if I'm going to read a 300-page novel, the main character had better change more than just now they wear colorful socks on weekends. Shorter, more focused pieces generally work better with smaller vectors. The amount of time that long or complex pieces require of readers should probably repay the reader's investment with a bigger sense of displacement. But the truer answer is that you'll want to scale your vector with the stakes of the piece. What kind of problem is the piece trying to solve? Write an argument paper that promises it's going to solve the whole economy, and readers are going to be disappointed if your vector only takes them as far as solving one part of the economy. Or write a piece of flash fiction about someone learning to tie a bow tie, and it's going to be pretty disorienting if it ends with them suddenly on Mars leading a protest against Mars Corp's destruction of the great Martian rainforest.
Ugh, that is the exact kind of thing Mars Corp would do, too. I mean, I would have to really try hard to remember the last time Kaputko destroyed a whole forest.
Well, that certainly is one way to say it, isn't it? Anyway, the point is that you could set up your readers' expectations for the magnitude of the displacement that they're going to experience. Open with a sweeping prologue about the conflict that has raged for generations, and they're probably going to expect an equally impressive journey from start to finish. Do the literary fiction thing where you zoom in on a young man and his disapproving father, though, and they might be totally satisfied with the father just finally saying, "good job," in the end. That's a teeny tiny vector, but it can be fully meaningful in the right context. And we could go through 100 more examples, but the short answer is that the right choice will depend on your project, the context, and your goals for all of it. Luckily though, we've got videos that can help you to consider that central driving force of your project and its overall structure, which will be linked in the end screen. Writing can feel like an impossibly complex task sometimes, but keeping a few elemental things in mind can help to simplify it and enable you to make real progress with the confidence that your piece will work out. And hopefully that's enough of a vector for this video to make you feel like you've gotten your—
Oh, I've got it.
Wait, where are we?
It's Mars, bud. Get over it. Listen, I want to show you something, but it's going to be a long hike.
Well, you warped us here. Couldn't you just—
Oh, don't get greedy. Of course I could, but watching you hike it will be much more fun for me.
Oh, for you. Well, it looks like there's a long, dusty road ahead of us, so for now I'll just thank you for joining us, and I guess we'll be reporting to you live from somewhere on Mars next week.